From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
It's been a wild few months in national politics, from the debt ceiling battle to the first ever federal indictment of a president. How does it all look to someone who's in his fourth decade on Capitol Hill? Our guest this week on Newsmakers, U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White, alongside 12 News Politics editor Ted Nesi. U.S. Senator Jack Reed, good to have you back in the program.
Thank you very much, Tim.
We got to start here. It was a monumental week in politics. Former President Trump in a federal court in Miami pleading not guilty to an indictment in a top secrets document case. You are ex officio on the Intelligence Committee. Has the type of documents Trump allegedly had in his possession come before the committee in any way? And are there any, I guess, from an intelligence perspective or even armed services perspective, are there any that are particularly concerning to you?
Well, they were described in the indictment, and they're all concerning to me. These are not trivial documents. These go to our defense. They go to the welfare and safety of our troops, which is the paramount concern I have. And they are very dangerous in the wrong hands. And the indictment is very compelling. As Bill Barr, his former Attorney General, said, if half of this is true, he's toast. But I want to emphasize, and it's two important things. This process demonstrates that no one is above the law in the United States. It also means that the president is presumed innocent until he is proven guilty by a jury of Americans in Florida. But the third point is very important too. Anyone who intimates, suggests that this should be met by a violent reaction, by anything to do with violence, does a great disservice to the country and the Constitution. Will be decided in a court of law, due process. He who's entitled to it, he'll get it. So I would urge all of my colleagues to speak out strongly and say, let the courts take this case forward.
Well, look, there are a lot of people who are not just Trump supporters that think that, the government is going after Donald Trump. They're targeting him, and no doubt you disagree with that assessment. But can you understand why people think that Trump is being targeted by the Department of Justice?
The major reason is that President Trump is orchestrating his campaign around this presumption that he's targeting, just as he was.
You think it helps him politically?
He thinks it helps him politically.
Well, I'm asking if you think it helps him politically.
No, I think with his supporters, yes, it resonates there, as many of his arguments do. But with most Americans, they'll sit back and say, this is a very serious set of charges. You've got people like Bill Barr, his Attorney General, saying, this is not trivial, this is serious. You've got Karl Rove saying, well, this demonstrates that he's reckless and irresponsible. So that is going to become, I think, more in the forefront.
But not a lot of your Senate Republican colleagues are echoing those comments by Karl Rove and Bill Barr.
No, they're not. And one of the factors is that they are concerned, particularly if they're in cycle, about a primary challenger, and they are being very quiet. But as I said, I think the one point that has to be emphasized, regardless of how you characterize the prosecution, is that this is a legal proceeding, and we cannot tolerate any type of violent public disorder or anything else. That is un-American.
I have one sort of historical question for you before we move on. We're talking about we've never seen a president indicted before to face charges, et cetera. When you look back now, do you think Gerald Ford made the right call pardoning Richard Nixon so that the Watergate situation didn't go through that and almost set the precedent that the president will not face, you can't go through this having a president go to court, and now it's heightened this Trump situation?
Well, I think there's a significant difference. Richard Nixon recognized that he was likely to be impeached because on a bipartisan basis, the Senate was ready to produce 67 votes. And that caused him to resign his office. And that resignation process took a lot of the angst of Watergate away, at least momentarily. And I think in that context, Ford was thinking about, that should be recognized. Here we have an individual who is screaming from the mountaintops that he's being frame, that this is all a witch hunt, that he's done nothing wrong, etc. And the thing I think that you focus on is one, these papers are very, very sensitive, and it's not a case of just misplacing things. He deliberately defied a court order. He deliberately moved papers and hid them. It took a warrant from a federal judge and FBI agents to find the paper. He would not give them up. And that defiance, and then the continued defiance, sets a new standard. Unfortunately, it's a lower standard. And I think that has to be considered at this point.
Just final question on this. If he is found guilty, should Donald Trump go to prison?
That's up to the judge. And it would be a very, very difficult judgment because of his position as former president. And let me tell you, though, in cases like this, it is routine for individuals to receive 5-year sentences or more. There are examples of people who have taken papers, they've not tried to pass them out to another intelligence, they just took them home for some idiosyncratic reason, and 5 years. We've got Airman Texera who's being charged. And I think most Americans say, jeepers, that guy should be in jail because he took papers and he put them out. So this is not just a minor misconduct. This is very, very serious, and I don't know. I would have to look at all the facts. It is a tough call.
But you do clearly, you have some worry about the civic fabric implications of a prosecution and a conviction potentially.
Well, I do, but frankly, no one has done more to unravel the civic fabric than Donald Trump, calling for a wild time on January 6th while we were carrying out our constitutional duties, encouraging a crowd to literally attack the Capitol, subject of impeachment. But again, on a political basis, I think my colleagues, and except for some remarkable people like Mitt Romney and others, couldn't stand up and say, this is outrageous. This is the worst attack on our constitutional history since ever, I think. Perhaps the Civil War, I'd have to say that. But so, if you're talking about unraveling the civic fabric, who is trying to use that to get reelected to the President of the United States?
All right, let's move on to the federal budget. You know a lot about that because you're on the Appropriations Committee, which decides where the money goes. You voted for the big debt ceiling deal. You didn't love it by any means, but you voted for it, that President Biden reached with the House Republicans. But before it was even law, you and some of the other defense-minded senators were talking about how to get some more money to the Pentagon beyond the cap that is put in place in this debt ceiling deal between Biden and McCarthy. But now the House Republicans, who of course are the conservative ones, are saying they're going to pass spending bills even lower than the caps in the bill. So it seems like Senate Democrats and the House Republicans are on a real collision course. You even have some of them already talking about maybe they welcome a government shutdown this fall to kind of, bring the spending debate to a halt. Where do you think this is going?
It's going to be a very rocky road because, as you pointed out, Ted, just this week, the Appropriations Committees in the House took money away from the domestic side, critical resources that we need for housing, education, Pell Grants, those things that middle-class families depend upon. And then they are attempting to increase defense spending. And at the same time, they released a Ways and Means tax bill, which will cut revenues by $1 trillion over 10 years or so, and they were just trying to shut the government down because of the debts. This is a policy that's going to have to be refuted, and it's going to have to be. We're going to have to recognize, we hope, the deal that the Speaker cut with the President, and there are some concerns we have, legitimate concerns. There would likely be needed a supplemental appropriation for Ukraine. They're in the midst of a struggle that if they lose, we lose everywhere across the world. That has to be done. There are additional military items that could be included, but there also has to be a recognition of domestic spending too. take, for example, our emergency response funds to wildfires and to things. That has to be funded. You can't put that off. So we're going to have to look at it going down the road. But, this behavior of the, making a deal and then unmaking it 2 weeks later, and then talking principally about we've got to lower the deficit, and then, well, here's an extra $1 trillion of tax cuts will lower the deficit, it makes for a difficult situation.
Can I ask you one other thing on the defense side of the budget, though? Because when I'll post stories or tweet out stories from some of the Washington outlets with your comments on, people screaming the Pentagon can't do it for $886 billion. And I'll hear responses from some people who are all the way on the other side of that issue and say, wait a minute, $886 billion sounds like a lot of money. Why can't the Pentagon cover the national defense for a year with that level of spending? You're a Democrat. Democrats generally at least are more open to, trying to keep the defense budget down. What do you say to people who think, well, wait a minute, Senator, have you gone Washington on us with the military budget? Maybe that's enough and they got to figure it out.
We try very carefully to analyze their request and determine what is necessary at the moment and what can be postponed or even eliminated. In fact, we're in the process now of eliminating whole classes of airplanes for the Air Force, A-10s and other planes, because they're too old. Last time we've directed that they decommission the littoral combat ship. So we are trying to.
But there's been a lot of fighting on that down in Florida.
I know, but there's always. But we understand that we have to go ahead and not simply just add. We also have to try to balance. The issue we're facing now, though, is and it begins, I think, with the strategic mistake of going into Iraq. For 20 years, we prepared to fight counter guerrilla operations, which. Different techniques, different equipment, different everything. Now we're facing peer competition and an active war in Europe, and we're doing a lot of
peer competition meaning China?
China, exactly, China. And Russia too, but China is the pacing threat. In those 20 years, they have made remarkable progress while we were essentially diverted into our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're now firing hypersonic weapons, which we're developing them, but we have to develop them. And we're also in the process of recapitalizing our nuclear deterrence, which means starting with the submarines, which we built here in Rhode Island, but also our land-based and our air-based deterrence. That's once in a 60-year cycle, but we're at that moment too. So we try to look very carefully, try to cut where we can cut, and and I can see many Americans would say, why you can do more, and we're going to try to do more, but we want to make sure that we are in a position that we can deter any type of conflict, because we have to win, but we'd like to deter it.
Why don't we take a break? When we come back, U.S. Senator Jack Reed is also chairman of the Armed Services Committee. As you can hear from the expertise there, we want to get his assessment on the war in Ukraine. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Yeah, those littoral combat.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White, alongside 12 News Politics editor Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Senator, you're wearing your American-Ukrainian pin on your lapel there, and that's what I want to talk about now. And I want to talk about armaments. We've discussed this with you on this program. The West has gradually increased its military support to Ukraine. It started with those shoulder-fired rockets, then armored personnel carriers, then longer-range rockets. Then the U.S. sent Abrams tanks, which was a huge deal. Germany, their Tiger tanks. Now Ukrainian pilots are being trained on F-16s. I read from the BBC, 150 of them. That's a staggering number. Is there a global risk, however, to providing Ukraine with weaponry that reaches into Russia? It's one thing to defend Ukrainian land, but when we're talking about longer range rockets and certainly F-16s that can pierce the border, is that a concern to you? And does it escalate the
It's a
conflict?
concern to everyone. And fortunately, I think the Ukrainians understand this very well. And the targeting decisions are made by the Ukrainians, but not without some input from the Western powers.
So you can use our equipment as long as you don't do this.
Well, they've made it very clear publicly that these systems should not be used in to attack within the boundaries of Russia, the established boundaries of Russia. Now, they have used their own drones to attack inside Russia. Mm-hmm. So they are also conducting through a group of Russians guerrilla activities within Russia. And that has been, to date, the Russians have recognized but not have retaliated. One of the issues, and we always keep an eye on, is escalation. If we do this, because it comes tit for tat, and where do we go? But they're very conscious of that, and they've used these weapons extremely well in terms of their employment against the Russians inside Ukraine.
Oh,
go ahead, Tim.
Well, how's the counteroffensive going by Ukraine? What's your assessment of the war?
Well, my assessment is that it was going to be difficult from the start. What the Russians have done, they have very poor troops, but they can maximize the quality of the troops by the
volume.
Well, the volume, one, and two, fixed positions. So they have 3 lines of fixed positions, trenches.
So it's like World War I trench warfare you're talking
World War
about.
I, but in depth. It's not just punch through and you're off to the races. It's in depth. So this is a difficult fight for the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are well trained, they are well equipped, and they are incredibly courageous. They are fighting for their country, and they're fighting really for everyone in this world who believes in a democratic system and wants to have protect their nation. And I suspect it's going to be a tough fight. I don't think they'll ever give up, and I think eventually they will breach these lines. And now they have the equipment, the armored vehicles, et cetera, for a breakout, so that they can quickly envelop the Russian forces. And the Russians don't have that kind of flexibility. They're not very good once you get into fire and movement. And that's what we've been training them.
Do you think we'll still be in a, well, but the Ukrainians and Russians will still be in a shooting war at the end of this calendar year?
I would not be surprised. The question would be, what is the intensity, and also what is the track in terms of some type of settlement, which would be acceptable to the Ukrainian people. And one other point is that David Petraeus, who was a couple of years behind me at West Point, and was just over there recently, and he is optimistic about the ultimate success of the offensive, and he brings great insights and talent to it. So that's someone who's been there, who's talked to people, and who feels it will work. But it's not going to be something that'll be over in shortly. And one aspect of this,
briefly, because we have so much we want to get to.
But one aspect of it's the political dynamics. What's going to happen in Moscow? Is Putin vulnerable to political movements, etc.? Do the Russian people finally say, we're tired of sending young men, basically, into a meat grinder, and they start making movements? That's another factor we have to consider.
All right, let's pivot from the heaviness of foreign policy to politics, a little lighter of a subject. And we have a little sound we want to play from a recent Newsmakers. This was David Sicilian's exit interview with Tim before I returned from leave. And we were talking about if he'd ever dabble in politics again. Here's what Sicilian had to say to that question.
Well, I guess I want to state a fact, and you tell me if I'm wrong. If Jack Reed retires, you would strongly consider jumping into the Senate race.
Jack Reed's not going to retire,
That's
and
not
I'm
the question
starting
I
a new
asked.
job.
I understand.
No, I've made a commitment to the Rhode Island Foundation. I'm going to approach that job with the same seriousness and commitment and dedication that I approach all the jobs I've taken, and I'm looking forward to doing that for a good long time.
People at home did not hear a no, though.
Look, I'm starting a new job that I am incredibly excited about, and I'm going to devote all of my energy to that.
And of course, it's hard to fathom a House member who might have aspirations to join the U.S. Senate. I know for people
You don't know anything
you wouldn't
about
know
that.
anything about that.
No,
Yeah.
no.
So,
Very unusual.
we're not trying to push you out the door, of course, but we've been surprised now twice by delegation retirement in the last 2 years. So while I don't see any indication you're thinking about retiring in 2026, how committed are you to running again for re-election in 26?
Well, before David took the job at the Rhode Island Foundation, he interviewed to be my campaign chairman.
Okay.
And, I guess
You're getting lined up early.
I guess he decided that the Rhode Island Foundation. Actually, I must say, David did a superb job as a member of Congress. It's a loss for the Congress. It is a gain for Rhode Island because the Rhode Island Foundation is the catalyst of so much that's going to happen here and must happen, and he'll do us.
All right, good ducking. Now back to
So,
2026.
Are you running in 26?
Listen, I prepare every day to run. That's why I go out, etc. But I have to get through a presidential election. I have to get through congressional elections this cycle, and that's my focus. Get the president reelected, retain the Senate for my colleagues who are talented people, and then we'll hopefully pick up the House, and we very well might.
All right, we have 5 minutes left, so I do want to pivot back to foreign policy briefly because I was fascinated by this story. The Wall Street Journal reported this month that China struck a deal with Cuba to build an eavesdropping facility on the island, just 90 miles from Florida. Massive concern that the People's Republic of China will potentially scoop up sensitive information. U.S. military bases are within reach of that kind of eavesdropping. Were you aware of this?
I was not aware of it, but apparently they established the base in 2019 during the Trump administration, and it's not unusual. I'm not surprised. They have listening bases in Argentina because they want to be able to look at satellite traffic, et cetera. They have listening bases in many different countries, and we also have that. But that provides, the proximity to the United States provides additional cautions we have to put in place for our communications. But this is a constant game of trying to penetrate what their signals are and their constant effort to do that. They also have, mobile, they have ships that have the ability to monitor, so they can get, and we do too, we can get close to the coast and try to pick it up. It is the proverbial, cat and mouse of intelligence, trying to figure out before they do what's going on.
We don't talk a lot about your position on the banking committee because your other ones get so much attention, but there's something you've been talking about here and there that I just find kind of interesting. You've brought up over and over in times when the bank executives are referring to the low rates on savings accounts at the big banks, that even though you've seen the Fed jack up rates so high, they're still paying a lot of people like 0.01% on their savings account, et cetera. I'm just curious, is that as a senator something you could actually see a legislative action related to trying to push that, or is it really just more trying to kind of jawbone the bank executives to be a little more generous to their depositors?
No, it's bringing attention to the fact that the banking industry has been not only enjoying good profits, but also they are, at moments of crisis, have been supported by taxpayers, by ordinary Americans. And in their plans, I think they should reasonably pay good deposits. But their argument would be, well, it's a market, and if, to attract deposits, we raise rates. If we don't have to do that, et cetera. But I think it's something that people should be aware of and, make the choice be conscious of their choices of financial institutions, which ones are generous, which ones are stable, and also which ones are really part of the community. That's important too.
We have less than 2 minutes left, and I can't believe it, but I too have a banking committee question. People can Google it because I don't have time to get into details, but there are sort of two competing bills to hold banking executives accountable following the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. There's the one the chairman has, and then Senator Elizabeth Warren has a bill.
And I have a bill with Chuck Grassley.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So I was going to ask you which of the two do you support, but you
I
sort of just probably support your bill.
It's absolutely the best.
In
bill,
30 seconds, what would your bill do if passed?
Well, our bill, if passed, would give federal authorities the ability to claw back remuneration that executives receive if, in fact, their conduct has been negligent or worse. Silicon Valley Bank was so poorly run, but at the same time, their executives were receiving $1 million awards, stock awards, financial awards. That's not fair. And I think what the point is not just getting back at someone, it's sending a signal to banking executives that they have to do their jobs well, or they won't be able to walk away with just piles of money.
20 seconds. I covered you a long time, so I think I know the answer. You will not, I presume, be endorsing in the primary for Cicilline's seat.
No, I think that the best judges are the primary voters, and then after that I'm going to do all I can to get the candidate elected to the United States Congress.
Yeah, I could have played that answer from a prior election cycle.
And in 15 seconds, it's a packed race. What would be your advice to any of the candidates?
Well, you got to get out. You got to meet people. And a lot of it's name recognition. So there'll be the ads are starting. That's a factor too. But in a race like this, you got to be out. You got to communicate. You've got to get local support. All politics is local.
All right. Senator Jack Reed, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.